It's my pleasure to introduce the next speaker. Bryan Grimwood is a professor in the Department of Recreation and Leisure Studies at the University of Waterloo, just across the border in Ontario and Canada. His research explores human-nature relationships in context of leisure, tourism, learning, livelihood, and is informed by principles of community-based participatory research, quantitative inquiry, and geographic notions of nature, ethics, and mobility. His recent and ongoing projects involve collaborations with Dene, Inuit, and other tourism communities to document the dialogue, culturally diverse knowledges, relationships, responsibilities associated with a special and changing Canadian Arctic landscape. As a parent and an outdoor educator, he himself is also interested in nature stories that we tell ourselves and live, what these stories tell us about being human, and the extent to which they foster resilient children, communities, and ecology. It's my pleasure. And join me in welcoming Bryan Grimwood.
Great. Thanks, Michael. I need to make one minor correction there. My research is more framed by qualitative inquiry, not so much by quantitative. Although I certainly have an appreciation for multivariate statistics. So I guess I want to start off with making two points. The first is, in my introduction there, Michael mentioned some background as an outdoor educator, and that's really where my pathway into ecotourism and nature-based tourism has come from. It's from guiding primarily youth on remote, or what we perceive to be remote wilderness river destinations in Ontario, in Manitoba, and in Quebec, provinces of Canada. So these would be long expeditions of anywhere from 15 to 25 days in length. And so that, so I have a sense of the beauty of these, very special landscapes, a sense of the very intimate encounters with those things we call nature, and also a sense, and I've experienced the kinds of transformations that can happen when people and nature interact. The second thing I wanted to do to start off is just identify a bit about my academic training is in human geography. And so, the metaphor of place is something that is fundamental to my research, and I have an affinity to context, to thinking through theory, thinking through research methodologies as they play out and help to shape various places. So yesterday in the two talks we had from Michael and David, is very global in scope. So we're hearing about various countries, we're hearing about UN, WTO, codes of ethics and initiatives. Today's talk that I'm going to be speaking to is very localized in a specific place. So this question around a partnership with nature is a question that I'm really intrigued by. I'm very curious about that. This as the underlying question of the symposium. So when I was invited to come speak, I was like, oh, this is a really juicy question. And it's a question that I think captures a foundational pillar in my research and teaching. Particularly, there's when I read a partnership with nature, a question mark, there's a critical component to it that leads me to ask these kinds of questions, like what kinds of partnership and what kinds of nature does ecotourism promote? What is manifest, what partnerships, what natures are manifest through ecotourism? These are words that we use to signify a whole suite of complex social ecological dynamics. Who do these partnerships serve, and whose visions and ideas of nature are we talking about in ecotourism? Who gets excluded, marginalized, or deemed external by these notions of nature and partnership? What can we do as a community of tourism scholars and practitioners to be more considerate, respectful, inclusive, or if we want to use the term responsible, in relation to these voices or externalities? These are externalities external to the tourism machine, what we typically think of as tourism, these sort of broader social contexts, broader cultural contexts, broader ecological contexts that all have something to say in relation to tourism. And what sort of political spaces might we create to engage or prompt, enhance public debate about the meaning and social values of ecotourism? So these are the kinds of questions that underpin my research in relation to the symposium topic. And so this is the abstract that I prepared. Fellow PhD student when I went through the program at Carleton University in Ottawa, geography there. She's a permafrost physicist, did awesome presentations. And so I asked Pascal a number of years ago what the key to her presentations were. And she said, you always have 3 points, whether you're talking for 10 minutes, whether you're talking for an hour and a half, you always have 3 points and you just repeat those 3 points over and over and over again to hit home. So the 3 points here are highlighted on the slide. I want to draw attention to how conventional ideas, meanings, practices of nature and responsibility in ecotourism can obscure human livelihoods existing within the landscape. So nature, responsibility are critical variables to what we define as ecotourism. To highlight ways for understanding and developing more culturally sensitive ecotourism, and that's going to come towards the end of the talk. And then to give some background on this place called the Thelon River in subarctic and Arctic Canada. So a little background here, sort of a bit of an overview. So I'm going to start with some background on the Thelon. Get into this sort of this tension, this relationship between nature and responsibility in the context of ecotourism, and then some points about how we might think about more culturally sensitive ecotourism. And so I've got a short little script here, and this is going to be as much as I read from my notes for the presentation, but the gist of my talk is to show how even in apparently ethical or benign forms like ecotourism, tourism is interwoven with power imbalances and serious tensions. In the context of touring the Thelon River, for example, responsibility is constructed around the principal ethic of leaving no trace, which is contingent on very specific ideas and practices of nature that inscribe the Thelon as first and foremost a pristine leisure landscape. So it's a place that we literally pass through for leisure tourism rather than consider inhabiting. So my research argues that this can limit the potential of nature tourists to more fully identify with the Thelon's historical and contemporary reality as indigenous homeland. And tourists are instead prompted to celebrate particular and romantic visions of an indigenous past and to obscure, if not completely ignore, the complexity of contemporary indigenous livelihoods existing within a landscape. So this is very much an argument that's framed around issues around social justice and voices that are traditionally or conventionally marginalized in dominant discourses. And so going back to my interest in the orientation of the symposium, the question then is what can we do about it? If we have these within the ways we talk and represent ecotourism, if we have these voices that are marginalized, that are excluded, how can we open up these our ways to doing ecotourism differently? So this is a Google Earth image. You can see the Great Lakes down on the bottom of the slide here. Does it show up the cursor? There we go. Yeah, and the red line here, I'm gonna have to. It's not gonna work. Okay, the red line is the Thelon River. It's a 900-kilometer river that the headwaters are in the boreal forest and stretches 900 kilometers out of the boreal forest into the barren land tundra. And so the image on the bottom left shows sort of that part of that transition zone, and the image on the right side of the slide is sort of the boreal forest. And this is a roadless terrain. There's the only way to access it would be by airplane, by foot, by snow machine, by canoe. The closest communities are Litzel Cay, which is located on the east arm of Great Slave Lake in the Northwest Territories. and Baker Lake, Nunavut, which is an Inuit community, the only inland Inuit community in Canada. It's a different representation of the watershed that shows how the Thelon traverses the Northwest Territory, the border between the Northwest Territories and Nunavut, two of the northern territories in Canada. And so it's a riverscape that crosses various jurisdictional political divides. And then there's the black area, the circle area, is one of the earliest conservation efforts in Canada. It's called the Thelon Wildlife Sanctuary. It was established in 1927. I'll talk a little bit more about that. This Great Slave Lake, this is the settlement of Lutzow, which is the contemporary settlement of the Lutzow Dene First Nation, whose traditional territory spans the headwater and upriver sections of the Thelon River. And they're currently going through a land claim negotiation process called the Acacho Territory land claim. And so that it not only is crossing, the riverscape not only crosses political jurisdictional divides like state divisions, state boundaries, but it's also crossing historical and ancestral territories between Dene and Inuit. So a lot of layers to this very special place, changing place. 5 charismatic mammals that inhabit this area: wolf, caribou, grizzly bear, moose, and muskox. The indigenous populations there historically and in contemporary times rely heavily on caribou as a primary source of food, of shelter, of tools, as a source of celebrating and creating community. And the Thelon has been fundamental to this. The Thelon has been a travel route into the inland of the Arctic tundra to access these creatures for harvesting, for subsistence. And this has been going on for generations. This is a slide of a famous, in Canadian lore, I guess, of a famous exploration gone horribly wrong. It's a gravesite of John Hornby is in the middle here, and his 2 companions. They attempted to spend over winter in the Thelon back in 1927, and they perished. They starved to death. And this has become very much a sort of a heritage site that tourists who travel the Thelon stop and visit. And the slide on the left here is a slide from Nunavut Parks, and it shows the Thelon is circled here. So these heritage values, these ecological values are all inscribed within the Canadian Heritage River System, which is a system of rivers that celebrate nationally significant rivers for cultural, natural, and recreational values. And a stretch of the Thelon, about 3/5 of the Thelon is designated as a Canadian Heritage River. So it's part of this national imagination of a special place within this Canadian Heritage River System network. As a tourism destination, it's this emblematic wilderness destination for expeditionary canoeists, kayakers, so people who are willing to spend large chunk of time traveling into remote destinations. So we've got maybe 100 to 150 people who travel this river by canoe every summer. There's a few different outfitters that operate up there that will fly in using charter airplanes to access the river. Canoe Arctic Blackfeather and the Great Canadian Wilderness Adventures are 2 examples. And so these are trips where people would be loading up their canoes with all their equipment, all their food, and traveling through the landscape for a matter of anywhere from 8 to 30 days. Some people who travel this river independently will spend the entire summer season, July and August, making their way through. There's also tourism in like wildlife tour operators that do some photography in the area. as well. But it's a very, as a destination, I wouldn't say it's developed by any sense. As a destination, though, there's certain aspects of the Thelon as a destination that reflect sort of broader trends within the Arctic and polar tourism literature, and so there's this push-pull of wilderness qualities. People seek it out because of these wilderness dimensions. And I'm going to go through these next few slides fairly quickly, and I've left the text there for folks on video who might want to access it later on. Press pause, if you will, and search for the content or take a look at the citations. So this push-pull of wilderness, which is also represented and used by various travel organizations to generate and promote tourism for regional development purposes. So this is a slide from Nunavut Tourism. This notion of the Arctic or polar regions as a fragile and disappearing place where ecological changes and cultural changes are taking shape. So this something that Harvey's written quite a bit about on this notion of last chance tourism, like we need to go see it before it's gone. That sort of mentality is at play within the Thelon. This idea that the tourism in the Thelon, part of the reason the Thelon was inscribed as within the Canadian Heritage River System was to generate economic or tourism dollars for economic development within the region. And that happened back in the 90s, and for all intents and purposes, that whole plan is for economic development through tourism in relation to the heritage rivers hasn't been successful. And then there's also this, as a destination, there's also a social status or a cultural capital that comes with touring the Thelon, which I think reflects polar tourism more broadly. So a large chunk of my research has been working a research project involving multiple stakeholders who consider the Thelon as a very special place. And it's an extended case study that engages different knowledges of these stakeholders to cultivate enhanced understanding and responsible relationships to a significant place within these contexts of social ecological change. And so this is a case study, extended case study that I've been working on since 2008, involving Inuit residents of Baker Lake, Nunavut, and River Canisius, using various visual, participatory, qualitative methodologies. Some outreach activities in Litsulke in the second phase in 2012, and then some ongoing work with the Litsulke Dene First Nation, which again is qualitative research, participatory, so where the research participants are key members of the research team. They're helping to design the priorities, the objectives of the research, the processes, the methods. And this is just a slide that shows various project components from photographic interviews. So where participants would share photographs associated with their travels to this riverscape with me in an interview format, and that we'd use those photographs as a point of dialogue to talk about this place. Experiential river trips. I had a mentor who told me, Brian, if you're ever going to do a PhD thesis, make sure you design it so that you can go on a canoe trip. And so I did, but I also took that a step further. So it wasn't just a canoe trip that I did along the through the Thelon Wildlife Sanctuary with one of those guides that I mentioned, but also spent time traveling within the riverscape with Inuit, and then community workshops with various groups to dialogue these knowledges and that were documented through the research. And so just some slides. This is the first slide, some photos here on the slide. The first photo up on the top left shows me on the back of a kamatek, which is a sled that Inuit carry behind their snow machines or behind their dog sleds. A charter aircraft and all the gear we're taking onto the Thelon, and then two examples of workshops with community members. And more recently, the work with Litsulke has been, as I said, very attempting to be as collaborative and participatory as possible, where members of representatives of the community are designing project objectives, processes, being key decision makers in terms of what the project is about and what the project does. And this is just the first page of a report that highlights that. There's a link down at the bottom that folks can access if they want to check that out online. And this is a second report that was compiled at the end of August 2014, after a couple of students spent spring and summer fieldwork seasons in Let's OK, carrying out participatory interviews and participatory workshops with community residents in Let's OK. And so this is where I'm going to transition to this relationship between nature and responsibility, and specifically some of the tensions associated with these conventional meanings of these words and how they influence behaviors and practices. And I wanted to start with this slide. And this slide was shared with me by a canoeist when he was asked to share a photograph with me that that in his mind represented responsibility. And so he shared this with me. He says, and I asked him, well, how does this, in your mind, reflect responsibility? He's like, well, as canoeists, we took a break. We pulled over the side of the river. We anchored our canoes, and we climbed up this rise to this panoramic, or this vista, where we could have these, beautiful views of pristine nature. And what's responsible about it in his mind is how these canoeists just automatically fan out into a circle, right? And the reason they fan out into a circle is to capture an image like this. And this is beautiful, right? This is a beautiful, beautiful landscape. It's pristine, it's untouched, it's clean, it's unsullied. Or they're looking for images like this, of muskox roaming the hills, or again, a beautiful scene. And I know that, I feel that, I see it, and and I respond to that, and I'm certainly sensitive to those landscapes. But I've got this, I don't know if it's my mentorship from Dave Fennell or not, but I've got this critical thing that just critical aspect to my scholarship that I don't just let that go. There's something else going on here too, and part of it is around identity. And the performance of identity in relation to the performance and the creation and the recreation of this thing that we call wilderness. And so in terms of identity, there's two things that are going on here. These canoeists are literally wearing their identity on their bodies. There's a very tangible identity performance that's happening here. Tourists are wearing very khaki-colored clothes. A number of them have their tilly hats. They look like they're adventure tourists. They look like they're explorers. They've got their instruments for enhancing their visual consumption of this landscape, whether it's binoculars or cameras. But this idea of fanning out in a circle, which is sort of a habit, is also about them seeking out and recreating this notion of wilderness. This fanning out, it's a little bit more abstract than them literally wearing their identity, but they're invested as subjects in this creation and this performance of wilderness. They're there to capture these images. They're there to capture these unpeopled, unhuman landscape images. And so in this image, I really see this as this interplay between nature, the performance of certain kinds of nature, as this performance of identity, but also this notion of responsibility, what it means to be accountable to one another. The performance of wilderness also takes place in terms of how canoeists, the other meanings and practices of responsibility associated with canoeing. So the majority of canoeists identified these principles of leaving no trace as fundamental to their ethic of responsibility while traveling. And so these are just a few quotes from participants that, responsibility means tread lightly and leave no trace but only footprints. So that mantra, take only photographs, leave only footprints. Canoeing leaves no trace, so canoeing is perceived as sort of this benign, non-consumptive form of travel. Cameras and binoculars belong, while machinery, lots of people, guns, and traps are out of place. So the fact that Inuit travel the Thelon in contemporary times by snow machine, by boat to access traditional harvesting sites is deemed out of place. And this quote at the top sort of captures it, that responsibility to this individual is about to respect nature and to leave it as we found it, so that future generations, our children and our grandchildren, will also be able to enjoy unspoiled nature as it was created. And this sort of idea of leaving no trace wasn't, for Canisius, wasn't something that was unproblematic. They identified that their flight in by charter aircraft, what could be 4 or 5 hours of airtime, was something that disrupted or that notion of responsibility. But they also saw, human traces in terms of, the second photo here are some arrowheads that were uncovered along the Thelon. They recognized these sorts of human traces, these presences, as belonging within the landscape. That's part of this idea of a human heritage that's a little bit more organic and existing within apparently simpler times. And so the underpinning these meanings and practices of responsibility is a particular notion of nature that has spatial dimensions. This perception of nature as something that's remote, external to our everyday lives. And so this is coded in the U.S. Wilderness Act. So these meanings and practices of responsibility in nature aren't just contingent on these individuals, but they're also these individuals are influenced by broader social structures. The U.S. Wilderness Act being one of many that sort of codes these peopleless places as ideal natural environments. There's temporal dimensions to this notion of nature too, that nature is at once literally running out of time in the face of modernity. I just need to point out that I don't necessarily object to these ideas of nature, I'm just sort of unpacking them. And I don't necessarily object to these notions of responsibility. Again, it's just sort of this critical unpacking to see what the limits are, identify these limits. So nature is literally running out of time, which translates into this notion, this sort of anti-modern nostalgia, where there's this desire to sense, to experience simpler times and more organic lifestyles. And this is sort of captured in the 2 quotes by participants that are included on the slide. So again, if you're watching at home on your video, you can pause and take a look. But it's also embedded in the photographs that Canisius shared. So these autochthonous, very place-based, organic kind of technologies. So whether that's arrowheads from Inuit and Dene times of hunting by arrowheads, by bow and arrow, or the second photo here is the site where John Hornby and his mates set up for that one winter before they perished. And so these all fit within these individuals' notions of responsibility of nature. And there's also this power knowledge dimension to these constructions of nature, and this power knowledge dimension is embodied by the guide. It's this deference to science and to the authority of direct experience. So we value as a society scientific knowledge. I certainly do. We value as society direct experience to inform our knowledge, and I certainly do, and I've actually felt this too as a guide, where the authority of my knowledge of the power that's invested in me as the guide is something that the youth or the other folks that I'm working with are expecting in order to facilitate safe travel through a particular riverscape. But it does some other things too. And I wanted to show this. So this is the guide leading a crew of us along a trail to a wolf den. And the point of this story is just to show how this deference to the authority of certain kinds of knowledge can lead to, is so pervasive, it can lead to the disruption of this notion of leave no trace, this notion of responsibility. So this is us following the guide to one of the many wolf dens he's identified along the corridor, the river corridor. He's someone who's been guiding in the area since the mid-1970s. He's trained as a wildlife biologist, so he's got this very, very profound knowledge of this area. And he leads us to this inactive wolf den that, you know, at the time, as we were exploring and searching for it, we weren't sure what we were going to find, whether, you know, wolves were going to be there or not. This one happened to be inactive, but it still provided an opportunity for tourists to take pictures, including myself. I actually got down on my hands and knees and crawled in there to see what it would be like to be a wolf in a wolf den. Took some pictures looking out to see what, you know, the wolf might see. I got some funny looks. But in some cases, you know, the authority of scientific knowledge, of the direct experience, this guide's power, leads to something like this, where they're handling wolf pups out in the barren lands. You know, so from a leaving no trace ethics perspective, or this notion of responsibility is disrupted here. There's some broader consequences, broader effects of this too, and I think what happens of these notions of responsibility, and this is captured in this magazine Canoe Routes, which is a sort of a popular press media outlet in Canada, and they often will have a series of like the top 5 rivers to paddle in Canada. In 2007, they identified the Thelon as one of those. And they had this quote up on the top of the slide that, you know, though the area is now empty of people, signs of ancient human life are everywhere. You know, so the contemporary presence of Inuit and Dene are excluded from this representation of the Thelon. And then a few years later, another one, again, this is to promote the Thelon as a tourism destination, once a veritable highway for nomadic Inuit hunters. Again, the contemporary presence, by the use of the word once, the contemporary presence of Inuit traveling the river by motorboat, by snow machine, by ATV to access ancestral sites is ignored. I think the other limitation here is that tourists identify themselves as the sole stewards. You know, if indigenous inhabitation is coded as something that happened in the past, then who's going to stand up and argue on behalf of these beautiful special spaces when, you know, threats of uranium extraction, gold, diamond mining come in? And this canoeist identified tourists as the sole stewards of this special place. If you don't have anybody standing up in the face of extraction, who's it going to be? If we don't have tourists going there, who's going to stand up? And it ignores the fact that Inuit and Dene have been resisting and adapting to the pressures of resource extraction, uranium, gold, diamonds, as I said, for years. So I think I've got about 5 minutes left, right?
5 minutes.
Yeah. So just to close off here, I just want to identify 4 points about how we might shift towards more culturally sensitive ecotourism. The first item here is to open up taken for granted ideas and meanings. And I could tell this story for you know, an hour and a half if I had an hour and a half. Try to be quick, but this is a photograph that I took of a spot where a dear friend of mine, an Nautalik, an Inuit elder who bilingual, who for some reason took me under her wing and helped support the research. But we went out on a number of journeys together into the Thelon area, and this is a spot where we stopped behind a large boulder as a wind block. It was on a snowmobile trip to a place called Halfway Hills. And we got a little bit of shelter behind here, and we gathered some tundra grasses and cooked a fire and shared stories. And then she says, Brian, do you see that rock? I was like, yeah, that's a big boulder. And she's like, no, the rock on top of the rock. I was like, oh. And so this is a different photo of that same rock. She's like, that's a Inukshuk. I was like, oh, well, tell me about that. And she's like, well, if you're traveling by river, by kayak, by motorboat, and you're looking for caribou, then this Inukshuk tells you where caribou comes from. You see that rock over there, Brian? And she's pointing to this larger rock on the boulder here. That tells you where good fishing is. I was like, oh, like really? Like you know, to me this is just, you know, a natural landscape, right? And she's like, no, this is very much something that has been made and remade by Inuit over time. And so here, if you're traveling by the river, along the river, and you see this Inukshuk, it tells you where good fishing is. But in order to read Inukshuk, you must be Inuk, she says. You must be Inuit. And so again, we have this interplay of landscape or nature, of identity, of Inuit identity, and responsibility. So these are signs left on the landscape for fellow travelers, for fellow Inuit to find and locate food to sustain or subsist and sustain their livelihoods. To locate commonality across differences is another thing we can do. And this example here is sort of sensing heritage is the example of a commonality across difference. And here, this is a canoeist who's literally sensing what it's like to flint knap and knap stones and bang rocks together to create an arrowhead. He was not at all successful, but he had that sort of kinesthetic appreciation. And this is another example from Inuktitut who shared this photograph with me. And I was like, you know, tell me the story. What's going on in this photograph? And she's like, well, and this is a quote from her. I really need to get the audio on it because you can just hear it in her voice how special this moment was to her. But she says, I was really happy, so happy to see the trees, smell the trees, the plants. It made me feel like at home where I came from with my parents. She grew up along the tree line. And when we burned the wood, I told my husband and my mother-in-law, come and smell the trees, smell the smoke. Oh, that was home, like way back from where I came from. My goodness, I was a little girl again. It's good to be back home. In this picture, I am old. In my heart, I was young. And so a different kind of sensing heritage here. So this was a really profound moment for me in identifying sort of the sacredness of the landscape. The next photograph that she shared with me was a sunset, and I was like, oh, well, why is this one? Is it just like a classic sunset image? And I was looking for something as magical in that, you know, in her discussion of that photograph. And I'm like, now tell me what's up with this photograph? And she's like, well, it's a beautiful sunset, dummy. There's another commonality across difference there. Relating to nature as a lived social space, and this is just a slide of a hunter who travels out to the Thelon, where the Thelon flows into Baker Lake, and he chisels out these large slabs of ice, brings them home, he stores them outside, and brings one slab in to his house at a time and lets it melt into a cooler. And this is sort of like the best tasting water that you could imagine. It's clean, it's pure. The elders in the community expect it for and desire it for their drinking water, for coffee, tea. I guess I'm going to stop there. My PowerPoint just shut down.
Timing is good.
Timing is good. The last one, last slide I had was just some examples around collaborating and participating with communities in the planning, management, and research process associated with tourism. And I think we'll hopefully have some other discussions later on in terms of folks that are working with communities in a sort of a participatory way to facilitate tourism development initiatives, to facilitate the management of tourism sites, and also potentially research as well.
Excellent.
Thanks.